our last segment of the year, and who better to have with Austin and myself than our friend Tim Verghese from inside Nebraska. Tim, how are you this morning, bud?
Hey, not too bad. How about y'all?
Oh, we're doing good. So no pressure. You're closing out the entire year of Hurrdat Sports Radio, so got to make it a banger.
Yeah, big news. Big
news. Tim, we have had some big news in the transfer portal for Nebraska, and that's the reason I wanted to have you on. I love your eye for talent and your scouting. So we've had some commitments over the weekend. First of all, out of the guys that have committed since you have been on last, which is, I think we've got 3 or 4 of them, who do you think can make the biggest impact for Nebraska next year?
Yeah, so I think I wasn't on between it's Nyziah Hunter and Deshaun McCullough. I think it's those two by far, in my opinion, in terms of who can give Nebraska the most in 2025.
So out of those 2 guys, the biggest area of need, was that wide receiver for you? Or I know some people got real nervous about the linebacker depth as well. Like, obviously, impact guys, part of it's on the talent of the player themselves, but part of it's an area of need. How has Nebraska addressed those?
Yeah, wide receiver. I kind of, after Nyziah Hunter, I kind of think the wide receiver room is pretty addressed, and I would say, if they're able to get anything more, we're still awaiting a decision from Dane Key. We could see a couple more visitors here in the second and third phase of the transfer portal. Kind of these visits. And so I think, we could see some more, but at this point, I feel like it's all complimentary and purely like icing, you know what I mean? Kind of on top of like what you have right now. Because I think you feel good about the wide receiver room with led by Nyziah Hunter, Ja'Cory Barney's still in there, Jalen Lloyd's in there, Jadarin Bonner's in there, Carter Nelson, Quinn Clark, the list goes on. If you feel better about that room with the addition of a guy like Nyziah who can kind of take over that wide receiver one, that big body outside receiver role, knowing what you have across the rest of that room and knowing, kind of how Dana Holgorsen likes to use wide receivers, running backs, and just the skill positions in general in the passing game.
So you brought up Hunter, the big-bodied wide receiver. I kind of envision him in what Nebraska sort of hoped Jamal Banks would be, and kind of what we saw flashes of Jamal Banks at during times of the season, especially a little bit later in the year after Holgorsen took over. But what's Nebraska getting from McCullough?
McCullough's a versatile chess piece in the defense. I mean, that's the best way to put it. He's a guy that I loved him out of high school just because, it kind of felt like everyone was looking for the next Isaiah Simmons at the time when he was coming out of high school, and he felt like that guy. And, he's developed. I think he's had an interesting college career, kind of going from Indiana to Oklahoma and kind of the stops along the way in his development. He's a guy that can play anywhere from Jack in Nebraska's defense to either of both the linebacker spots to potentially even Rover. He's a guy that I think John Butler is going to find a lot of creative ways to kind of utilize him across the defense. He's a guy you kind of, in the Big Ten with some of these matchups you get, some of these elite tight ends you could potentially see in the conference. He's a guy that can kind of, line up with those guys, can line up with the receiver potentially, but also cover his own ground, in the run game, cover space and zone coverage. And he can rush the pass a little bit. I'm actually intrigued to see how much Nebraska uses him as a pass rusher because there's some flash there. But I just want to see, exactly how much Nebraska is going to use it. But that, like you mentioned, I think addresses a key need there where, there's some concern about at least the linebacker depth because you have some talented guys coming in like Christian Jones and Dawson Merritt and Pierce Newberry, but obviously those guys are young and you needed an instant impact kind of guy. Deshaun's that guy.
Tim, when it comes to the newest additions to the roster, there's always been that conversation about what Rhule sees as his recruitment base and the type of guys that he wants on the team. Have you noticed similar characteristics, maybe in talent, evaluation, just who these guys are in newcomers to the program, that maybe they have a similar trait or something that Rhule sees similar to all of these new pieces?
Yeah, I think regardless of position, whether it's, Marcos Davila, the backup now expected to be, the backup quarterback, to Justin Rhett, to Deshaun McCullough, and even, some of the D-line additions, they're adding athletes. I mean, these guys are really, really good athletes. We talked all year about it felt like there were times in certain positions Nebraska felt like they had an athletic deficit. They're addressing that just by at the very least what you can say about all these guys they're very good athletes, and I mean, a perfect example, with Justin Redd. I don't really know what to expect from him. He kind of was limited even as a senior in high school. Then he hasn't played much over the past 2 years at Georgia. So, it's a guy that with a lot of clay to work with, a lot of raw tools and a lot of raw athleticism. But who knows how much exactly how much Nebraska is going to be able to get out of him. But at the very, very base, he's a very, very good athlete.
We're talking with Tim Verghese from Inside Nebraska. Tim, as you're kind of going through the areas of need and checking off boxes, you go, okay, they've added a few guys on the defensive line. They're probably good there. They've added at least, a couple linebackers. You feel like they're okay there. You mentioned they shored up wide receiver. They've shored up some of the specialists on special teams. In your mind, what's left here? Basically corner and offensive tackle? Is that about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, offensive tackle is the biggest need, and it's not for a lack of trying. Obviously, if people have been following, obviously who they've had in town. Obviously, Isaiah World was in town, but Nebraska lost out to Oregon. It's tough to beat out Oregon for instant impact type players right now. They had Keegan Trost, the swing tackle from Wake Forest, visit, but he committed to Missouri after visiting Nebraska and Missouri. And then they had the Washington State transfer offensive tackle in town too. We're still awaiting his decision and what he ends up doing. But he visited Michigan. You don't really feel good. There's some waning confidence now from Nebraska. So I think that's a position that over this next week, when visits are shut down for the holidays, visits restart Jan 1st. But while the visits are shut down, quote unquote shut down, I think it's going to give the staff a good opportunity to kind of sit down, evaluate the talent in the portal, and really attack with, some decisiveness on like, okay, here's who we need. Here's what we need specifically at offensive tackle. And then honestly, like I could see them addressing corner. I think safety is a bigger need in the secondary right now. I think they'd like to add a veteran safety or two. And again, they had a guy like Marquavius Moss from West Georgia, a talented guy that could play, a couple of different positions in the back end of the defense this year. But he committed to Kansas State instead. So I think that's a position you're going to see them try and address coming out of the dead period, this short little, week and a half dead period.
Tim, how much does the status of like a Turner Corcoran and a Teddy Prohaska have to do with how they feel about offensive tackle? Is that something you think they may not address until the spring in that second period where after they get a chance to see those guys again?
Maybe, but I also think that's a position you can't really afford to wait and see what happens. If you can find a guy that can come in and start, you swing, and that's the reason why they had Isaiah World on campus and Lilly from Washington State. I think both those guys are, instant impact guys that would almost certainly start in Nebraska. And so that's the thing. I think they're looking for guys, and I think they would also, I think guys like Teddy and Turner would understand, like, hey, with where Nebraska is right now, they need instant impact guys, especially considering both those guys' health status. Specifically Turner, you would like another quality. You could move him inside potentially. And with Teddy, it's kind of a wait and see thing on how serious that injury is and how well he's able to recover because, at this point, having that many injuries in a row at his size, we just don't know what he's going to end up looking like.
Tim, are you expecting any more special teams looks? They got the long snapper. They've continued to look through other pieces in the portal. But is there any other piece that Ed Foley or Matt Rhule is still looking at when it comes to the portal as of today?
I don't think so. I mean, I really think, listening to the way the staff talks about John Holt and still, what they still believe about Tristan Alvano, I think, I don't think that the kickers are going to be a position they address necessarily, but who knows? If a good one pops up and there's one that makes sense, I could definitely see them, at least covering their bases and making sure they do their due diligence. But right now, I think they're good where they're at, and honestly, I think they've seriously improved the special teams just functionality.
Tim, I had a question in the chat, more of a process question than anything, but like, does all this, the transfer portal and everything, does that make your job more fun? Do you like all the activity, or is it just kind of like, this sort of feels like a chore?
No, I mean, it's fun in a way of just like getting to track all these different names and, see where guys land, I think more as like it's a bit chaotic right now. I'll say obviously, and I think more than anything at this point, it's I like the transfer portal and kind of what it can do for guys, but at the same time, I think there needs to be just a serious adjustment to the calendar. Like this is too much for some coaching staffs and even recruit. Like more than anything, I feel real bad for some of these recruiting staffers that are basically working, like 12 to 15-hour type days, balancing watching film and making sure, the board is, a very fluid board right now in the transfer portal. This isn't like recruiting where, you add guys to the board, you get an opportunity to host them on campus, you wait and see what they decide, and you slowly, make adjustments to the board. Every single day the board's adjusting. You can offer a kid one day, the very next day, or, very next day, very same day, he could commit elsewhere, all of a sudden he's off your board. It changes so fast.
Tim, we appreciate it as always. Great to have you on, and hope you enjoy your holidays, and we'll talk to you in 2025.
Yes, sir. Always a pleasure. Happy holidays.
Thanks, man.
Thanks,
you
Tim.
too. That's Tim Verghese from Inside Nebraska. That's Austin Jacobsen. I'm Ravi Lulla. Shane, appreciate you as always. This has been Hurrdat Sports Radio. We will see you on the 2nd.